Hey everybody, it's Mr. White here with part 2 of our notes about inflation. So if you didn't watch the first set of notes about inflation, make sure you go back and watch those so that you can understand what inflation is before we go any further. For those who've already watched the first set of notes, awesome, here we go. Today we're going to talk about measuring inflation with something called the Consumer Price Index. Now, there are lots of different ways to measure inflation. Like there's this thing called the Producer Price Index, where we measure the cost of inputs for businesses. But in this class, we're going to focus on something called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. The Consumer Price Index is a measure of the overall cost of goods and services bought by the typical urban consumer. And the way that we know that is that we have this thing called a market basket, which is just this metaphorical list that represents the average monthly spending of goods and services, where the products in the market basket are fixed for a period of 10 years. Now, this is all computed by an organization called the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BLS. And this list that's in the market basket contains 8 major groups and over 200 different subcategories. Everything from food and clothing, all the way to things like tattoos and tobacco and alcohol. Basically anything and everything that a typical urban household of 4 would purchase. And when I say urban, I just mean lives in or around a major city. When I say a household, I mean like a family of 4. And so on average, the Consumer Price Index market basket is around $4,000 or $5,000 per month for the average American family of 4. That just means that all the goods and services, literally everything they buy, costs about that much. Now, the thing that's interesting to note here, as I said, the items and the quantities are fixed for a period of 10 years. And so that's going to create some interesting things that we have to consider whenever we're analyzing the Consumer Price Index. Now, to really understand the Consumer Price Index, you got to understand this market basket thing. So if you're still kind of confused, like what does he mean by this market basket? Like I said, it's not a real actual basket. It's just sort of a metaphorical basket. It's like a list of what the average family of 4 buys. And as I said, the quantities and the items in that list are fixed for a period of 10 years. So what I've done here is I've made up an imaginary market basket. And let's say that this imaginary market basket only contains things that I think a teenager might buy. So let's say that in the average month, a teenager buys 8 movie tickets, they buy 50 gallons of gas, they buy 5 burgers, they buy 2 milkshakes, and they buy 4, let's just say medium popcorns at the movie theater. Okay, so those are the items that are going to be in our market basket, and those are the quantities that are in our market basket. And all we're doing is tracking how the price of those items changes, but we're keeping the quantities and the items the same. So for year 1, if we wanted to calculate the cost of the market basket, what we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to take the cost of the item and we're going to multiply it times the quantity. So you can see here it'd be 8 times 250, okay? 50 times 175, 5 times $3, 2 times $3, and 4 times $4. Once we get the cost, we can add all those costs together, and that'll tell us how much our market basket is going to be, what would be the total in year 1. So if you need to, pause the video for just a second. How much is our market basket cost in year 1? In year 1, the market basket cost $144.50. So that means that if you're going to buy all these things in these quantities in that first year, you would spend $144.50 per month. So go ahead and calculate the year 2 item market basket. How much would it cost to buy all of those items in those same quantities in year 2? In year 2, our market basket would cost $182.75. Okay, what about year 3? Year 3 would be $232.25. And year 4, it would be $286.75. Wow, it got a lot more expensive. Now, this points out one of the problems of the Consumer Price Index. You'll notice that all these things stay the same regardless of how prices change or anything else that might change. Now, one thing that I was really paying particular attention to is the cost of a movie ticket. Look at the increase in price of movie tickets from year 3 to year 4. It almost doubled in price. Well, do you think that we're still going to buy 8 movie tickets if the price of a movie ticket nearly doubles? Well, just think about the law of demand. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'd be watching a lot more movies on Netflix. But the thing is that the Consumer Price Index can't take that into account. So even though we might substitute more Netflix watching and have fewer movies in real life, the consumer price index is going to assume that we're still buying 8 movie tickets. And so the total amount in our market basket may not reflect the real world amount of spending that the average family of 4 is doing, because sometimes when things change price dramatically, we're going to substitute and we're going to get something else. Now, to compute the consumer price index, or the CPI, it's a pretty simple little formula. We just take the current market basket cost for the year that we're looking at, and we divide it by the base year market basket, and then we multiply that times 100. The base year just means the year that we start counting from. And in real life, the base year is 1983. So in real life, when we compute the consumer price index for the year 2020, we're taking the market basket cost in 2020 and dividing it by the market basket cost in the year 1983. Then we multiply by 100, and that gives us our consumer price index. So for example, if the current market basket costs $1,500 and the base year market basket was $1,250, our CPI is 1,500 divided by 1,250 times 100, which gives us basically 1.2 times 100. And so that means our CPI is 120 in our current year. Okay, so prices have inflated by 20% since the base year. That's the utility of this consumer price index. If you're wondering what's the point of making this consumer price index, you'll notice here that it's 120. Essentially what we're saying here is that prices are 20% higher than the base year, and the base year is always going to equal 100. The reason why the base year always equals 100 is because if our base year is 1250, that would be the current year if we were trying to figure out what is the CPI in the base year. So we'd say 1250 divided by 1250. We know that any number divided by itself is 1 times 100. So the CPI would always be 100 in the base year. So if you ever see a CPI number that's 100, you know right off the top that is the base year. The base year is always equal to 100. So if we're ever trying to figure out how much inflation has happened between the base year and some other year, we can just look at the CPI for that other year. In this case, it's 120. We would just say 120 minus 100, we know that's the base year, and so that would be 20% inflation. That's just sort of a nifty little trick if you know the CPI. Now, you're not always going to be calculating inflation from the base year to some other year. Sometimes you got to calculate inflation between 2 years that are not the base year. And in that case, you need to use this formula to calculate the inflation rate. Just so you know, inflation rate is pi%. And we talked about this before, but just in case you forgot, right? Inflation, oops, I don't want to do the black highlighter. Oh my gosh, here we go, yellow highlighter. Inflation is pi%. So to calculate the inflation rate, you take the later CPI, or we'll just say CPI2, minus the earlier CPI, or we'll just call that CPI1, divided by the earlier CPI, CPI1, right, times 100. So for example, if year X had a CPI of 145 and year Z had a CPI of 165, then our inflation rate is 165 minus 145 divided by 145 times 100. That's 20 divided by 145, right, times 100, which is 0.1379 times 100, or 13.79%. So that means that there's been 13.79%. You can't just say 165 minus 145 is 20 and it's 20% inflation. That doesn't work. All right, so now that we know our market basket cost for each year, we can go ahead and create a consumer price index with our little milkshake example. So let's just go ahead and say that year 1 is our base year. So that means that the consumer price index for year 1 is equal to 100. What would be the consumer price index for year 2? Well, we just have to apply the formula. So the CPI for year 2 is the market basket cost, which is 182.75, divided by the base year cost, which is 144.50, times 100. So if you need to pause the video, that's going to be a CPI of 126.29. So that means that between year 1 and year 2, prices have increased 26.29%. Now, just for practice, why don't you go ahead and calculate the CPI for years 3 and 4. All right, so here you can see we have the CPI for years 3 and 4. So now we can actually figure out how much inflation is going on here. If we wanted to know the inflation rate between year 2 and year 3, we would just take the CPI for year 3, which is 160.7, minus the CPI for year 2, which is 126.3. Then we divide by the CPI for year 2, 126.3, and then we multiply that times 100. So that would give us 27.2% inflation from year 2 to year 3. Now, just for practice, why don't you go ahead and calculate the inflation rate from year 3 to year 4? All right, so last thing we want to talk about is just the difference between the CPI and the GDP deflator. They are both price indices, but they're not exactly the same, and here's the main reasons why. The first one, the CPI holds the quantities constant. Remember, we said that we keep those same numbers of items in our market basket regardless of how technology changes or regardless of how people's tastes might change. So the idea of the CPI is just to reflect the prices of goods and services purchased by households. But even though the CPI is a good measure of what the typical household buys every month, it can't account for, like I said, things like substitution bias, the idea that we might buy something different if the price changes dramatically, or changes in products. Like, for example, if we fix the CPI for 10 years, if there's a big change in the way that we do word processing, like the difference between a typewriter, as you see here, and a laptop computer, the CPI cannot account for those changes in technology because it's only recalculated once every 10 years. And so the price of inputs for businesses are also not reflected by the CPI. So sometimes the CPI might show that the inflation rate is really low, but that just means the inflation rate for households is really low. And there might be a different story going on for businesses, but the CPI doesn't really tell us about that. Now, the GDP deflator, on the other hand, holds prices constant. It reflects the level of output relative to a base period. So remember, we're using the prices of goods and services from the base period. If you forgot, go back and watch that video about GDP where we talked about the GDP deflator. So this accounts for all goods and services produced. It's not like the CPI that just accounts for the goods and services that are purchased by households. And so GDP is a much more holistic idea of what's happening with production in the economy, whereas CPI is just sort of a look at what's happening with prices that are faced by households. So just make sure you know the difference between those two. They are not the same thing. All right, so time for a quick summary of everything we've learned about inflation. Remember, inflation is just an increase in prices over time, and the inflation rate is the percent change in prices over time. We can also have deflation, which is negative inflation. We can have disinflation, which is a slowing down of the inflation rate. We can have hyperinflation, which is extremely high inflation, like what happened in Germany in the 20s or in Venezuela today. And we have stagflation, which is high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Remember that inflation makes lenders worse off and borrowers better off because it affects the value of money. If the lenders lent the money that had more purchasing power than the money they get paid back, then they actually lose and the borrowers win. Demand pull inflation is when the demand for a good causes the price to go up. Cost push inflation is when higher input costs for businesses cause the price to go up. And the quantity theory of inflation says that too much money in circulation can cause prices to rise. The consumer price index, as we just talked about, is that measure of the price of goods and services commonly purchased by households, and it's used to track inflation faced by consumers. And so that's going to be the main measure of inflation that we use in this class. And the last thing here, the market basket used by the CPI is just a metaphorical basket that has a fixed number of items and quantities for 10 years, so it can't account for substitution bias or changes in products. All right, guys, that's it for our notes about inflation. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me. Other than that, thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day.